On the 20th of March 2003, the United States, United Kingdom and their coalition allies Australia, Poland and the Kurdish Peshmerga launched their invasion of Iraq with the goal of deposing Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. The invasion followed months of diplomatic overtures and a large military build-up before the United States gave Hussein an ultimatum: give up power and leave the country or face the consequences. In this video, we will analyse the two sides in theatre militarily and their strengths and weaknesses prior to the start of the war. We will discuss their equipment, training and the overall quality of the armies involved in Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Hold on 7, this is Groen 1, troops in contact. Coordinates to follow.
First, we'll look at the coalition forces, beginning with the infantry. The United States, United Kingdom, Australia and Poland deployed some of their best forces for the invasion. A total of 309,000 soldiers organised into 6 divisions, a Marine Expeditionary Brigade, a US Army Airborne Brigade and Special Forces. The coalition would once again do battle with the once proud Iraqi armed forces. Before Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the Iraqi army numbered 1 million men in 56 divisions. By 2003, the army had been whittled down to approximately 350,000 men in 16 divisions. Augmenting the regular army were Saddam's best military units, the Republican Guard divisions. However, Desert Storm had destroyed most of the 8 divisions of the Republican Guard troops, although they had been reconstituted into 6 divisions numbering roughly 50 to 60,000 men before 2003. A special Republican Guard unit fielding a further 15,000 men was formed in the aftermath of the 1991 war, which had the express mission of defending the regime against any coups or internal strife. It was commanded by Saddam's son, Qusay Hussein, and was also the only unit allowed to enter the capital of Baghdad. Like many paranoid dictators, Saddam's obsession with internal politics led him to handcuff his own military. Following the post-1991 uprisings in southern Iraq, the Iraqi leader decided he could not trust the military and had forbidden them to train in large formations lest they try to march on Baghdad to topple his regime. Local commanders did their best to prepare their soldiers for combat, but the Iraqi army was a shell of its former self when the war came. Even the Republican Guard was affected by this decree, and there is no evidence that Saddam's so-called elite formations underwent rigorous training before the invasion. Meanwhile, a US Army infantryman could expect 22 weeks of training, and the British Army could expect 26. For both armies, the time spent in basic and specialist training could be longer or shorter depending on the role. Training duration varied among different branches, but all coalition powers boasted soldiers who had been trained to NATO standards. The UK and US Marines had somewhat different roles and approaches to warfare. US Marines basic training lasted for 13 weeks, and Marine Infantry underwent a further 59 days of specialist training. Meanwhile, Royal Marines Commandos had to complete a rigorous 32-week course, the longest basic training course in NATO. American Marines, fielding their own armoured and mechanised forces, were expected to be the spearhead of the ground push, breaking through Iraqi defences on the way to Baghdad. The Royal Marines were less suited to this role, being specialist light infantry, so were used to seize key objectives like airfields or ports, and advance through the heavily urbanised suburbs of Basra. British SAS and SBS, US Navy SEALs, Delta Force and Green Berets, along with Polish Grom Commandos, operated more purely as special forces, and all were considered among the best special forces in the world in 2003. The standard American infantryman was equipped with the M16A2 rifle, or its carbine version, the M4. As a carbine, the M4 was smaller and stockier, but packed a similar punch to the M16A2. Both the US Army and Marine Corps still issued the M16A2 as standard, and this was slowly augmented in both services with the updated M16A4. Meanwhile, selected personnel like vehicle crews received the shorter M4 carbine. Both weapons proved to be an effective weapon in desert conditions, but the M4 was more popular due to its smaller size and lighter weight. The British Army had already settled on its standard issue weapon, and its infantry went into battle with the L85 rifle. Popularly referred to as the SA-80, the L-85 had been introduced in 1985 and underwent several modifications culminating with the A2 upgrade in 2001. While it was heavier than its American counterparts, the SA-80's bullpup design allowed for the longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity of the M16A2 in a weapon that was the same overall length as the M4 carbine. The average Iraqi soldier was often a conscript equipped with the standard AK-47 assault rifle. The Iraqi military also carried AKM and AK-74s, but the reliable AK-47 was the most common infantry weapon for good reason. It was durable, easy to operate, and had been produced in such large numbers that every soldier in Iraq could find them. However, Iraqi infantry had little else to combat the enemy. Soviet-built RPG-7s were plentiful, but newer Western armour designs made these less capable in combat. The lack of training also played a major role in reducing the Iraqi infantrymen's combat effectiveness. The Iraqis would be fighting on their own territory, which allowed the regime to deploy a new weapon against the coalition, the Saddam Fedayeen. The Fedayeen were a paramilitary force of between 40,000 to 50,000 men, recruited from Ba'ath Party strongholds, such as Saddam's home city of Tikrit. The Fedayeen had no formal training, spending only a few hours on learning to fire AK-47s or RPGs before being thrown into combat. This led to predictable results. One Iraqi resident in Basra recalled after the war that the Fedayeen would conduct raids in parties of 20 men, but only 2 to 3 would return. However, their main asset was their fanaticism and loyalty to the Ba'athist government. Whereas regular army units were liable to flee when faced with coalition forces, the Fedayeen tended to stand their ground and fight to the last. Leading the coalition's armoured units were two of the best tanks in the world, the British Challenger 2 and the American M1A1 Abrams. The Challenger 2 was the newer design, having been introduced in 1998, while the first M1A1 entered service in 1986. The US Army possessed the newer M1A2 Abrams, but none had been issued to units that took part in the initial invasion of Iraq. Instead, the US Army and Marine Corps relied on modernised M1A1s. The Abrams and Challenger 2 were similar, with each possessing excellent composite armour arrays, developed from British-designed Chobham armour, capable of defeating both armour-piercing sabot and high-explosive anti-tank rounds. Furthermore, both tanks came equipped with 120mm main guns, although they differed slightly in that the Challenger 2's barrel was rifled, while the Abrams was smoothbore, again due to the slight differences in armour doctrine. Regardless, the coalition tanks could easily outrange their main competition, the Iraqi T-72. Although the T-72 had a 125mm gun that could hit targets up to 2,000 metres away, the coalition tanks had an array of sensors and range-finding equipment, which meant their effective range was closer to 3,000 metres, with optics that could see through harsher conditions. It is also worth mentioning that vastly better recon and command and control capabilities of the coalition meant that coalition tanks could also be more efficiently used. Altogether, the coalition fielded 600 tanks for the invasion. The coalition's armoured fighting vehicles were similarly excellent. The British Warrior tracked armoured vehicle and the American Bradley fighting vehicle were excellent designs which had already proven their usefulness during the First Gulf War. The vehicles were similar, having been designed to carry infantry to battle and provide direct fire support. The Warrior and Bradley possessed less armour than the coalition's main battle tanks, but were highly manoeuvrable as a result. The Warrior's main weapon was a 30mm autocannon, while the Bradley could engage targets with a 25mm chain gun. Furthermore, the Bradley carried the TOW anti-tank guided missile, which could hit targets up to 3,750 metres away, meaning the Bradley could hold its own in armoured engagements. The US Marine Corps also deployed the Light Assault Vehicle or LAV, as well as the Assault Amphibious Vehicle or AAV. The AAV had been designed to bring Marines ashore during a beach landing, but saw extensive action in the Iraqi desert. It could carry 25 men compared to 7 for the Warrior and 6 for the Bradley. Although it was not as heavily armoured, The AOV was fitted with a Mark 19 grenade launcher and a 50 caliber machine gun, which made it highly effective in close quarters urban combat. Although training was severely lacking, the Iraqi regime did deploy large formations of armoured vehicles. Iraq was thought to have between 1,800 to 2,000 combat-effective tanks prior to the invasion, down from the 5,500 tanks it deployed before Desert Storm. The vast majority of these were old Soviet and Chinese designs, which were woefully obsolete against the modern Western tanks. As mentioned earlier, the most advanced tank in Iraq's arsenal was the Soviet-built T-72M and T-72M1, which had served Iraqi forces well against Iran. Iraq maintained roughly 700 T-72s, which were mostly distributed to the Republican Guard divisions. This number includes the Lion of Babylon tank, which was the domestic version of the Soviet tank. The T-72 had several advantages. At 41 metric tons, it weighed significantly less than its Western counterparts. By comparison, the M1A1 Abrams weighed in at 57 tons, and the Challenger 2 weighed 62.5 tons. This meant that the T-72 had better mobility off-road, and could cross less sturdy bridges and terrain. Furthermore, it had a lower profile than both the Abrams and Challenger 2, at only 7 feet 4 inches tall, nearly a foot shorter than both Western tanks. On the other hand, the T-72s had significant drawbacks compared to its competition. Like many other Soviet designs, the T-72's ammunition tended to detonate when the tank was hit, leading to a catastrophic detonation, often throwing the turret of the tank dozens of feet in the air. This has been nicknamed the Jack-in-the-Box effect by Western military analysts. While this is often attributed to the carousel autoloader of Soviet tanks, the actual reason was poor ammunition storage around the tank in general. Even outside of the autoloader, live ammunition was stored unprotected around the crew and the fighting compartment. This meant that any successful penetration was likely to ignite the stored rounds. Conversely, both the Challenger 2 and Abrams were designed to protect the crew from ammunition detonations. On the Abrams, almost all of the tank's main gun rounds were stored behind sliding blast doors in a protected rack at the turret rear. Above this rack were blast panels, designed to be blown off by detonating ammo, venting the explosion up and out of the tank away from the crew. The Challenger 2, meanwhile, used armoured bins beneath the turret ring to protect the high explosive rounds and ammunition charges. The T-72 also contained inferior optics and lacked any modern thermal imaging systems, relying on passive infrared night sights, unlike the tanks of the coalition. During the tank battles of Desert Storm, the Iraqi tank crews often never saw any American or British tanks before their own vehicle was destroyed at long range. The Iraqi army deployed plenty of other tanks, such as the Soviet-built T-62 and T-55, or the Chinese Type 59 and Type 69 tanks, but these vehicles all suffered from the same defects as the T-72, and were even more obsolete by 2003. The fleet of 3,700 armoured personnel vehicles had a similar profile. Almost all were old Cold War designs. Many, such as the BMP and BMP-2, along with the MTLB, had been state-of-the-art when first introduced, but were now hopelessly outdated. The BMP-2 offered good mobility and weapons, but was no match against the Bradley or the Warrior. As an example of how obsolete the Iraqi army's vehicles were in 2003, coalition forces reported engagements against BTR-60 and Chinese-built Type 63 armoured carriers, both of which had been designed in the 1950s. Artillery is often referred to as the god of war, and the coalition brought a variety of artillery systems to bear during the invasion. The two premier tube artillery systems for the coalition were the American 155mm M109 Paladin and the British 155mm AS-90. The AS-90 was a newer design, having been introduced in 1992, whereas the Paladin was a heavily upgraded version of the original 1963 design. The Paladin and AS-90 could fire shells up to 30,000 meters. Their ability to shoot and scoot allowed them to avoid counter-battery fire and keep up with advancing troops. The US Marines did not employ Paladins or any self-propelled tube artillery, and instead relied upon towed artillery such as the M198. The reason for avoiding the self-propelled guns was simple: they were too slow, too big, and too heavy. The Marine Corps preferred the 198 because it was lightweight, easy to load onto ships, and could be airlifted into any combat zone. The L118 105mm light gun served the same purpose for the British Army. The British had used the L118 to great effect during the Falklands War, taking advantage of its light weight to move entire artillery batteries onto the islands. Like the American M198, the L118 could be airlifted or dropped by parachute into combat zones. The coalition also deployed rocket artillery. The US Army made extensive use of the reliable M270 Multiple Launch Rocket System, or MLRS. The MLRS could fire all 12 of its 227mm rockets in less than a minute, and blanket an area with over 600 small bomblets. It could also be outfitted with the MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile System, better known as Atkines. The Atkines serves as a tactical ballistic missile, which has a maximum range of roughly 190 miles, and was originally designed to strike Warsaw-packed reserve columns in a Cold War gone hot. American commanders used Atkines during Operation Desert Storm, and would eventually fire 450 missiles during Operation Iraqi Freedom. The Iraqi army procured most of their artillery from Soviet stockpiles. The two most common towed artillery pieces in the Iraqi infantry were the D-30 howitzer, which first entered service in 1963, and the M46 field gun, which was even older, having seen combat for the first time in the 1950s. These were capable guns, if not grossly outdated compared to the American and British towed artillery pieces. The Iraqi military also possessed self-propelled artillery vehicles, such as the Soviet-built 2S-1 and 2S-3. But the most common Iraqi artillery piece of all was the BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launcher. The BM-21 was one of the most iconic Soviet designs of the Cold War, and remains in service with many countries today. Although the rocket fire is not as accurate as Western MLRS artillery, the BM-21 is cheap to build, and is a quintessential shoot-and-scoot weapon. One battalion of 18 launchers is able to deliver 720 rockets in a single volley, but most BM-21s in the 2003 invasion operated independently. It could be a dangerous weapon in the right hands. On the whole, Iraqi artillery compared unfavourably, but not as unfavourably with Western weaponry as other types. Unfortunately for the defenders, the coalition could wield much more potent resources to spot and destroy targets. Fleets of unmanned aerial vehicles and satellites could identify Iraqi artillery positions before they even fired off a shot. Iraq possessed no countermeasures for these advancements in battlefield technology. Air power would once again set the stage for the campaign, as it did in 1991. In terms of air-to-air combat, the coalition was completely unchallenged. The United States, United Kingdom and Australia deployed a fleet of the most modern aircraft in the world to the Middle East. Most of the coalition's combined air forces consisted of multi-role aircraft such as the F-16 Fighting Falcon, FA-18 Super Hornet, F-15E Strike Eagle, Panavia Tornado and Harrier. These were deployed to strike both ground targets and aircraft such as helicopters. Single-role aircraft such as the A-10 Warthog or AC-130 Spectre gunship also played a part in the campaign. The A-10 and AC-130 provided close air support for the ground forces, while heavy bombers such as the B-1 Lancer and B-52 Stratofortress were tasked with striking targets deep behind enemy lines, as well as loitering near the front lines to provide persistent close air support to ground forces. If the target was especially well defended by Iraqi air defences, the F-117 Nighthawk and B-2 Spirit had stealth capabilities which allowed them to go mostly undetected by their enemy. The coalition also enjoyed overwhelming superiority in helicopter strength. The premier attack helicopters in the war for the United States was the AH-64 Apache, which could carry 70mm unguided rockets, Hellfire anti-tank missiles, and a 30mm cannon. The Hellfires were especially lethal and could hit targets from 5 miles away. Apaches were rugged and well armoured, boasting over 2,500 pounds of armour within the airframe. The 2003 Iraq War also marked the first use of the AH-64D longbow, which sported a radar dome fitted above the rotors, which considerably improved situational awareness and allowed multiple targets to be engaged simultaneously with the new radar-guided longbow Hellfire missile. The US Marine Corps did not use the Apache and instead deployed the older but reliable AH-1W Super Cobra. The Cobra had been in service since the 1970s, but continuous upgrades ensured it would continue to remain battle effective. The British military used the agile Westland Lynx helicopter in an attack role. Like the Cobra and Super Cobra, the Lynx had been designed during the Cold War and had been updated throughout the years. Both the United States and the United Kingdom called upon light and scout helicopters such as the American OH-58 Kiowa and the Anglo-French Gazelle, which mostly performed recon missions. The US 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, used the AH-6 and MH-6 Littlebird, which combined light attack and light transport duties. The most common transport helicopter was the American UH-60 Black Hawk, which could carry 10 to 12 soldiers and 2,600 pounds of equipment internally, as well as 9,000 pounds externally. When more troops or equipment were needed to be airlifted, the CH-47 Chinook was called upon. The Chinook could transport 44 men, or lift up to 28,000 pounds, which made it ideal for heavy transport duties. Chinooks could lift artillery pieces, vehicles, or ammunition pallets and travel up to 1,000 miles. The mainstay transport helicopter of the Royal Navy and Royal Marines was the Westland Commando HC-4, a license-built and upgraded version of the American S-61 Sea King. The Commando HC-4 could accommodate 28 Marines and lift up to 6,000 pounds, not as much as the Chinook, but the helicopter served the Royal Marines' needs well. The British also deployed the Sea King ASAC-7, a unique variant which performed an airborne early warning and control function. In many areas a generation behind the Army, the US Marines mostly used the older UH-1 Huey for light transport duties. The Marines also deployed the CH-46 Sea Knight, which was ancient by 2003. First introduced in 1964, the Sea Knight was obsolete and had several reliability and maintenance problems in the desert conditions. Its replacement, the V-22 Osprey, was already in the works, but was not ready in time for the invasion. The CH-53 Sea Stallion was the heaviest transport helicopter in the Marines' lineup. The Sea Stallion was also old, but could carry 38 troops and lift up to 13,000 pounds. Satisfactory requirements for the US Marines, who were embarking on their longest campaign march in almost 200 years. Prior to Desert Storm, the Iraqi Air Force was one of the largest in the world, boasting over 550 combat aircraft. By 2003, the first Gulf War and the results of the United Nations-backed no-fly zones over Iraq had severely degraded the Air Force's combat effectiveness. When Operation Iraqi Freedom began, Saddam's senior commanders had less than 300 obsolete combat aircraft to work with. As it turned out, Saddam believed they had no use in the coming war. The Iraqi Air Force did not mount a single sortie during the entire invasion, rendering this fleet of aircraft worthless. Most were captured or dug out of desert hiding places following the end of hostilities. Similarly, the Iraqi Navy had been completely destroyed in the First Gulf War and posed no threat in combat. Air defense was a priority for the coalition, but not because of any threat from the Iraqi Air Force. In fact, the main concern was Iraqi ballistic missiles, which were a major threat during Desert Storm. During the 1991 conflict, the American-built Patriot PAC-2 SAM system had difficulty destroying Iraqi Scud missiles. The main issue was the Patriot's warhead. The missile relied upon detonating near the target to destroy it with its high-explosive fragmentation warhead, but Iraqi Scuds moved so fast that the Patriot tended to destroy the missile body, but the Scud warhead would survive the blast and continue on a ballistic trajectory, often causing damage on the ground. In the following years, the Patriot PAC-2 was upgraded to the GEM-T standard, rectifying these problems. A new missile for the Patriot, the Ballistic Missile Defense Specialized PAC-3, entered service in 1997. The PAC-3 was designed to physically collide with the incoming target before detonating, drastically improving its effectiveness. In 1991, perhaps the most difficult task of Desert Storm was reducing Iraq's extensive air defense network. Iraqi surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns shot down dozens of coalition aircraft, especially vulnerable low-level ground attack aircraft such as the British Tornado. The Iraqi air defense network had been slowly degraded throughout the 1990s by the no-fly zones conflict, but a considerable portion was still intact by the beginning of 2003, although many of the Iraqi systems were beginning to show their age. The three SAM systems, which could engage coalition aircraft at altitudes above 15,000 feet, were the SA-2, SA-3 and SA-6. The SA-2 could track targets up to 80,000 feet, but had to be kept at a fixed site, making it vulnerable to British Alarm and American HARM anti-radar missiles. The SA-3 was slightly more mobile, but still easy pickings for Wild Weasel missions. The SA-6 was the most effective air defense weapon for the Iraqis. It could track aircraft up to 40,000 feet and was completely mobile. Coalition aircraft would have a difficult time finding and neutralizing these systems during the war. Additionally, the Iraqi military fielded hundreds of Soviet and Chinese anti-aircraft guns, such as the Zu-23-2 and the S-60. Although these systems could theoretically shoot down aircraft up to 40,000 feet, they were far more effective at close range. They were deadly adversaries for coalition helicopters, as would be demonstrated later in the campaign. One of the highest profile precision munitions used in the war was the cruise missile, where the coalition enjoyed a decisive technological advantage. The two most prevalent cruise missiles were the Conventional Air-Launched Cruise Missile, or CALCM, and the Tomahawk. Each served a different purpose. The CALCM carried a larger warhead of 3,000 pounds, compared to the Tomahawk's 1,000 pound payload, and could destroy most surface targets. However, the Tomahawk had a much longer range of over 1,000 miles, while the CALCM would only reach 680 miles. The Tomahawk was deployed from the destroyers, cruisers and submarines of the US Navy, while CALCM was only employed by the US Air Force's B-52s. Making its combat debut was the low observable, long-range MBDA Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile. Launched by RAF Tornado GR4s, the Storm Shadow can fly in from a stated 350 miles at low level using a variety of navigation technologies to hug the ground and follow the terrain to avoid detection. Just before arriving at the target, the Storm Shadow can be configured to climb and then dive on its target, switching to an infrared seeker for higher precision, and increasing penetration if the target is a bunker or hardened. On impact, a smaller charge clears the soil or roof of the target before the main 450 kg warhead passes through and detonates inside. British donated Storm Shadows and French donated Scalp, the French variant of Storm Shadow, have also seen what appears to be quite successful service in Ukraine during the recent conflict, hitting Russian logistics, railways, warships and generals far behind the line. Ballistic missiles were a key part of the Iraqi inventory, although the regime lacked any cruise missile capabilities. It was well known before the 1991 war that Saddam's military had a history of importing ballistic missiles from the Soviet Union or China, and then modifying them for its own needs. The most famous of these was the Soviet-built Scud-B. The Iraqi army modified the Scud into the Al-Hussein missile, and expanded its range from 190 miles to almost 400 miles. Additionally, the Soviet-designed Frog 7 rocket was modified with a gyroscope and submunition carrying warheads, which were extensively used during the Iran-Iraq War. However, the Iraqi stockpile of Al-Hussein missiles was destroyed under United Nations supervision following the 1991 war, forcing Saddam to turn elsewhere. Instead, Iraq began developing its own indigenous short-range ballistic missile program. The Ababil 100 and Al-Samud missiles were developed in this program and had not passed the experimental stage when the war came. Both ballistic missiles carried a little over 600 pounds of high explosive, although the Al-Samud had a longer range of over 100 miles, whereas the Ababil 100 could not travel further than 90 miles. To circumvent UN sanctions, Iraq cannibalized guidance systems from Chinese Silkworm cruise missiles and allegedly imported GPS systems from Belarus. Despite these efforts, the Iraqi-built missiles were mostly ineffective. The Ababil 100 suffered a high failure rate, with up to 30% of the missiles failing on the launch pad, while several others suffered in-flight disintegrations. Plainly put, these indigenous ballistic missiles were almost as dangerous to the Iraqis as they were to the coalition. The naval element of the campaign was no contest, as the two leading naval powers in the world went to war with a nation without a navy. 5 US Navy aircraft carriers stationed in the Persian Gulf each had approximately 70 fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft aboard, while the Royal Navy contributed HMS Ark Royal and HMS Ocean, both carrying helicopter-only air wings to theatre. The US Navy also deployed amphibious assault ships, which could carry helicopters as well as various landing craft to carry men and supplies ashore. The Harrier could also take off and land on amphibious assault ships, which were key to the opening operations of the ground invasion. Surface vessels such as cruisers, destroyers and frigates also played their part in the campaign. Their contributions included launching cruise missiles, providing naval gunfire support, and additional helicopter landing pads. Every single US cruiser and destroyer carried between 40 to 80 Tomahawk missiles, while most coalition ships had at least one main gun over 100mm. Initially, the coalition also stationed surface vessels and submarines in the Red Sea, but these assets were withdrawn following complaints from the governments of Turkey and Saudi Arabia. To summarise, the coalition forces on the eve of combat in late March of 2003 could expect to enter battle with the best military technology in the world. Overall Commander General Tommy Franks hoped their superior equipment would bring shock and awe to the enemy. Although the coalition had a massive advantage in firepower and the benefit of modern military technology, the Iraqi military would be fighting to defend its own soil. The coming battle would be a test of whether modern warfighting technologies could quickly subdue and successfully occupy an entire country. The final war of Saddam Hussein's bloody reign was set to begin. The immense technology displayed in this video was developed using the engineering and computer science skills that you can learn free and easy with this week's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant is the best way to learn maths, engineering and computer science interactively. Brilliant is fun and interactive, with thousands of lessons from basics to advanced topics, and new lessons added every month. Topics they cover include AI, computer science and programming, how everyday technology works, and engineering. Whatever your skill level, Brilliant customizes content to fit your needs and lets you solve at your own pace. Take a quick quiz when you sign up and you'll be matched with content that fits your skill level and interests, whether you're a complete beginner or you're ready to join Lockheed Martin. Not sure where to start with programming? The new Thinking in Code course gets you designing simple programs to solve real-world problems straight away, from app development for map navigation to writing a program that automatically responds to work messages. Sign up for Brilliant today and start learning with a free 30 days. The first 200 people to sign up will get 20% off an annual plan by visiting brilliant.org/The Intel Report. Thanks again to our amazing patrons who help make these videos possible. Welcome to all our new patrons this month, and a special thanks to our patron of the week, Aaron Roberts. Each week we select our favourite Patreon reactions to shout out. This week, Rear Admiral NJ says, "Good old US Marines using wildly outdated tech is still the tip of the spear. If you'd like to join our Patreon and get access to exclusive benefits such as early access to videos ad and sponsor free, we would love to have you as part of our community.